Hi, this is Ken McCarthy of the System Club, and today we're opening the doors to everybody because we're talking about a very important book that I'm going to recommend everybody get and everybody read, and you're going to understand why as we get into some of the details. Our guest today is Ryan Holiday. I know many of you know his name. For those of you that don't, we're going to talk a little bit about his background. Even people that know him and know his work may not know how he got to where he is today. He is a best-selling author. Is it true that you've sold over 2 million copies of books at this point?
Yes, it is true. It's been a pretty incredible run.
That's amazing. That's a lot of books, especially given the topics. You know, you're not writing romance novels or blockbuster fiction books. These are books that make people think.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty surprising to me and certainly to my publisher that, you know, I'd sell that many copies of books that are, you know, primarily about an obscure school of an ancient philosophy. But I think, you know, ultimately word of mouth is a powerful tool, and if you can write or make something that people want to recommend to other people, it's short of no stopping it.
Now, your first book came out in 2012,
Yep.
Just 7 years ago, and you've been writing a book a year pretty much, it looks like.
Yeah, sometimes more than that. It's been quite a ride.
So your first book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator, and this is a book that I've recommended since the day it came out. We have a lot of people on the call who are entrepreneurs, they're marketers, they're marketing advisors, they work heavily on the internet, they use publicity, and if you don't know this book and haven't read it and haven't absorbed its lessons, you need to make a direct line to get this book right away. It's one of the most practical books in terms of explaining how things really are in the publicity world, and that's Trust Me, I'm Lying. You've also got another book that I think would be of a lot of interest to entrepreneurs, the Growth Hacker Marketing, Primer of the Future of PR Marketing and Advertising. Can you tell us a little about that book and how you came to write it?
Yeah, well, what I was doing in that book is looking at, you know, for a very long time, marketing was you hire a marketing agency, then you hire a publicist, and then you sort of go through these traditional channels. But when you look at companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and Uber and, you know, sort of this sort of class of multi-billion-dollar brands that sort of came of age in the last 10 or 15 years, they basically, although they might have all those resources now, that's not where they came from, right? Airbnb first venture raise was $30,000. They didn't turn around and hire a $15,000 a month publicist. So how does a company grow itself very, very rapidly the way a startup does? And I think there's a bunch of lessons. And primarily what they focus on is growth, not attention, you know, not brand, not hits or whatever. They focus on, like, look, is this driving user acquisition, yes or no? And so the book is sort of the lessons from that community.
Great. And you've worked in this field. You're not just an armchair theorist. Could you talk a little about some of the clients that you've had over the years and some of the things you've accomplished with them? Yeah,
I started a company called Brass Check in 2012, but before that I'd been the director of marketing at a company called American Apparel. And yeah, I think one of the problems with this space is a lot of the people that write about marketing make most of their money writing about marketing or have been out of the game a very long time. And so what I was trying to do in those books is sort of talk about these things from the perspective of a person who's actually done it, you know, from a person who's, you know, worked with very fast-growing brands, and like, what does, you know, what it's easy to talk about, you know, oh, start a blog, but, you know, how does that work? What does that look like? What are you actually trying to accomplish? You know, what I was trying to talk about in Trust Me, I'm Lying is like, look, here's my experience actually, you know, repping controversial people. Here's what it's like to wake up and find out that, you know, a false rumor is spread all around the world about you. Or here's what it's like to, you know, create, you know, a massively viral campaign that costs like $100. Like, here's how that works. And so, yeah, I've been lucky enough to work with, you know, big companies and little companies and, you know, best-selling authors and interesting public figures. And what I think my specialty has always been is, like, how do we do a lot with a very little? it's hard to learn lessons from how Johnson & Johnson does their marketing. I mean, they have every resource you can imagine. But if you're launching a Kickstarter, you're much closer to where Airbnb was, which is you don't have any money for marketing. So what can you do?
You've also worked with Robert Greene and our colleague of his. I know a lot of our listeners
for several years of my writing career, and I wouldn't be here without his sort of guidance and help.
What a great job for someone who loves to read widely, because I think hopefully most of our listeners know Robert Greene's work. Fantastic stuff, The 48 Laws of Power, The 50th Law, and they're kind of somewhat like your books. In other words, they stand on their own, and you can get a tremendous amount from them, but they're also portals. They're launch pads. So you start with one book, and it leads you to maybe an author you never heard of or a series of books that you weren't familiar with before, and now you're going down that profitable rabbit hole, and you just find yourself, filling out your understanding of the world. So what did you learn working with Robert? Were there any big lessons that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you raised is actually one of those lessons. Like, to me, a book should be a starting off point. It should be an introduction to a whole bunch of new things that you didn't even know you didn't know about. And that's certainly what Robert's books were for me, and many of my favorite books were like that. And so, yeah, I try to distill things down, but I try to also make it clear to the reader that this is only the introduction. There's all that you should follow these sort of threads where they lead. I think Robert taught me about the importance of story, the power of story. If you notice, all of his books it's not Robert Greene telling you what the laws of power are. It's Robert Greene illustrating the laws of power through stories of history and literature. And so he's sort of stepping back a little bit. He's not making it about him. He's making it about a narrative. And that's definitely something I've tried to do in my own books as well.
There's a lot of Chinese literature where they'll take, this, like all languages, Chinese has a lot of sayings where they boil down, stitch in time saves nine, and the Chinese have thousands and thousands of them. And there are a number of great books that will take one of those 4-character sayings and blow it up into a 5, 10, 20-page story so that you really understand the richness of where that particular wise saying has come from.
Yes, I mean, my book, The Obstacle is the Way, is partly based on a Stoic maxim and Zen maxim, that the idea of the obstacle being the path. And yeah, you can take 4 or 5 word expression and you can turn it into a 60,000 word book, because you can illustrate it with stories that prove the idea or argue against the idea. And that's what I try to do in my books.
Well, let's talk about that. So you started out in business on the promotion marketing side, in the trenches, making stuff happen, taking a little bit and doing a lot with it, finding the points of leverage, maximum leverage, and you documented that in the books that we've talked about so far, Trust Me, I'm Lying, and Growth Hacker Marketing. Then you made a switch to a different kind of topic. How did that happen? So you started writing about the Stoic philosophers?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a writer. That's what I wanted to do, and I just had this sort of detour as a marketer, and I think it was an important detour, and I learned a lot, and it certainly helped my writing career. But what I wanted to do was write about sort of ancient philosophy. I wanted to tell stories, and I sort of ran these tracks parallel for a while, and then after the success of the first book, and then the second book, I was able to pivot and sort of have more control over what I wrote about, and I was able to command an audience. So, it's interesting, like when I'd written about sort of philosophy and stuff online for a long time, so when my first book came out about marketing, a lot of those fans were like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. And then when those books did well, and then my third book was about Stoicism, those people were like, wait, I thought you were a marketer. This seems like a strange switch. So the reality is they were sort of just parallel tracks, and then I sort of switched much more heavily over to writing about self-improvement and ancient philosophy, because that's what I'm most excited about.
Well, we talk a lot about the value of the old school in marketing. I'm forever telling people they should familiarize themselves with John Caples and Maxwell Sackheim and these old school mail order guys.
Sure.
Because they really understood what it took to get people to stop, pay attention, read, and take action. And they had a much more challenging situation than we have today, because if somebody wanted to respond to an ad, they had to get a stamp and an envelope and a piece of paper, and they had to fill out the form. They had to get, now people can just hit a button. So if you can see how the old timers made it work, and apply those lessons to today, you have a good chance of doing very well. So if we take this old school, reverence for the old school to the next logical step, we go back to people whose thoughts and philosophies and ways of life have stood the test of not just, the last century, but the last, several millennia. So what were those guys doing? How did they think? How did they survive? And so this is, I find it to be a natural transition to go from marketing, which is an intense study of how the world is, how the social world is, to, slightly deeper inquiry into, okay, what's this life for? What's it all about? And your latest book, Stillness is the Key, to me is a meditation on that question. What is a good life? What is a worthwhile life? And how do you attain it? And that seems like a question that's almost too big to even tackle. And yet, if we're going to approximate a good life, we have to begin to tackle it. We have to think about it.
Sure.
And that's what you've done with Stillness is the Key. So I see a pattern. I see the obstacle is the way, ego is the enemy, stillness is the key. Did you have these envisioned when you started, or have they been unfolding?
Not exactly. I had some sense of where it was going, but I certainly hadn't. I didn't think. I didn't see it as a trilogy until I started the third one. But I do think you're right. The thread sort of runs through all the books, which is like, what can we learn from the past that can help us with the present? And, it's not a coincidence, like the second or third chapter in Stillness is about sort of managing your inputs, as so many people I know are just miserable because of what they see on the news every day and how they're jerked around by their devices. So I think at the core, wisdom is fungible. What you want to do is find insights or perspectives that stand the test of time. I mean, there's a line, I think it's in Ego, from Otto von Bismarck, where he says, like any fool can learn by experience. I prefer to learn by the experiences of others. And I think that's what I've been trying to do in all my books, which is, like what can we learn from the things other people have gone through that help us when we go through similar things. And Stillness, to me, is about a question that people have had for a very long time, but feels particularly urgent now, which is like, how do I manage all this stuff that's being thrown at me? How can I slow things down? How can I be in control of myself? How can I clear my mind so I can do whatever the important work I'm trying to do is?
Yeah, it's a great untapped resource for a lot of people. I'm forever encouraging people to read more, and even if you don't like the physical act of reading, books on tape, however you do it, take advantage. For instance, we're never going to be able to talk to Bismarck or Napoleon or Rockefeller or Claude Hopkins, and yet these guys either wrote books or had their writings collected or their sayings collected, and for the price of a so-so lunch, you could have the wisdom of a person's entire life in your hands. It's like, why would you not take advantage of that? So
I don't understand people who don't. I just don't understand it.
Yeah, and so we both want to encourage everybody, if you're not on this reader's path, seriously consider it, because I guess you said it was Bismarck that was talking about experience. I mean, If I could get 60 years of somebody's experience in my hands and save, because we don't have unlimited time to figure it all out ourselves. We need a boost. We need, actually, no, you were talking about leverage. A book from a wise person is, one of the greatest pieces of leverage you'll ever get your hands on in life.
It's a head start, right? Why start at the beginning when you can start where they left off?
Yeah. And one of the things I find really important about this book is, I focus on business and marketing, and that's sort of the emphasis of what we talk about, when we're together, with my clients and customers and friends and colleagues and partners. This makes sense. If we were basketball players, we'd talk about basketball. We're business people, we talk about business. One of the things I've seen over the decades, and now it is decades, is some sort of fundamental thing. We all know this is true, but it bears saying. Money and success and achieving those things does not solve life's problems.
No, whether you're a billionaire in a private jet or you're, sitting in your car in traffic on a way to a minimum wage job, like you still got you, and you still got those racing thoughts, and you still got, finding what you want to do and how you're going to spend your time. You still have your mortality. We're all dealing with the same stuff, and I think the important thing to realize is that you're not all that different than someone who lived 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, whether they were a king or a peasant. And so this is just the sort of perennial struggle of the human species. But again, I think this goes to what we're saying. The good news is there are some insights that have been discovered, and we should avail ourselves of them.
And we're really not getting this kind of thing, and for lack of a better word, I will call it wisdom. I mean, it's
sure.
You've collected wisdom in this book, and we don't get a lot of wisdom from the television or the internet or the news. We might get it from the internet if we go to the right sources, but typically we're not getting it.
The opposite of wisdom, right? We get information, or we get sort of deliberately manipulated or manufactured content that's designed to provoke or placate us, right? Like, in many cases, I would argue that, whether you're watching CNN or Fox, not only is the information you're getting probably not accurate, but it's even if it was accurate, is it worthwhile? Is it actionable, or is this just like, look, if someone sits down and tells me they watch 5 hours of Netflix every day, I would actually think they're probably healthier than someone who watches 5 hours of CNN or Fox News. Because at least one of them is being honest with themselves about their love of entertainment. The other one is probably ironically inflating their ego and making them feel like they have a clearer grasp on things when actually it's probably escaping their grasp.
Well, and also commercial media in general, it's appealing to our basest instincts. In other words, instead of saying, right? Instead of here's a noble way to live, or here's a deep, soul-satisfying way to live, it's like, here's something new you can buy. Here's something to be envious about. Here's somebody
something to be
hate.
Angry about. Here's something to be worried about. Right. There's very little in the way of sort of moral education in what we see in the news.
Yeah, and I don't know what your education was like, but I don't remember my formal education dealing with these subjects. We learned about history, we learned about mathematics, we learned about science, but not much about values, if anything.
Yep.
And so if we're going to get these things, we have to actively seek them out. We're not going to stumble across them. And there's some beautifully simple and practical things in here. One of the chapters I love, because it's one of my crusades in the last several years, is sleep. It may seem like a really simple thing. There's a great story of Warren Buffett. I don't know if you know this one, but it was a while ago. It was probably 20, maybe even 30 years ago. There was a bank that was about to go under. Might have been Wells Fargo. They were in real bad shape, and he was called in to help pull it together. And he arrived, and he was in the conference room, and he looked out over the conference table, and he had all the bankers, and he said, "Look, tell you what, let's meet tomorrow. You guys need some sleep," because they all looked completely exhausted, And this is something, I don't know, maybe this has always been a problem, but maybe the internet has exacerbated it. But people just thinking that, we can burn the candle at both ends, and less sleep the better. It's almost become a macho thing, and maybe it's my age, I don't know. But I beg to differ. I think sleep is one of the great things you can give yourself, and you'll actually get, in my experience, if you'll discipline yourself not to work excessively and stop and get adequate rest and get adequate sleep, you'll actually
of course.
be a lot
no,
more.
it's nobody does good thinking when they're tired, and yet we somehow think sleeping, which sets up good thinking, is like laziness, and we sort of glamorize this sort of what we call it hustle porn. Like, look how hard I'm working. Look at Elon Musk. Like, nobody's working harder than Elon Musk. Also, nobody's making more unforced errors than Elon Musk. You could probably say the same thing about Donald Trump. I saw it at American Apparel with Dov Charney. You're working hard, but the unforced errors, that's where you lose everything. And that's what happens when you're not taking care of yourself, when you don't have stillness, when you don't have discipline, and it's a dangerous thing.
There's two other sections of the book I really like, and it's uncanny sometimes how things work out. The day before I got your book, I was thinking that one of the most important things, and it's one of the earliest lessons a child gets, and I was thinking of this because I saw it. I was in the mall, and I saw a tiny little girl, and she had obviously just learned the word no. Mm-hmm. And really understood what it meant and was using it on everybody. She used it on the cashier and would laugh. It was very fun to watch.
Sure.
And I realized that early lesson in life, the recognition of no, how powerful that is. And I often tell people that it's the best time management tool you'll ever find is the single word no. And you go into that in your book. You have a whole chapter on it.
Yeah, look, I think early on in your career, it's all about saying yes, right? That's how you get momentum. That's how you get started. That's how you get your break. But then at some point it flips where if you're saying yes, it's actually coming at the expense of your career and your happiness and your personal life and all of this. And so you have to figure out, actually I have to say no more than I say yes, so that when I say yes to things, I'm saying yes to the right things. And I'm all there and all in on the things that I do say yes to. It's tricky, man. I struggle with it myself. But when you look at really successful people, they've got a lot of barriers between them and the incoming inquiries for a reason. So they're not the bad guy, and so they're not tempted to say yes to things that don't matter.
Speaking of dealing with success, success gives you many, many more opportunities than you have when you're first getting started. You're just trying to get traction anywhere you can.
Right.
So the right strategy is to say yes to everything. But there is a transition point where the opportunities distance your ability to take advantage of them, and you have to start saying no. And some of us, surely, I know on this call, have found ourselves in situations where we're doing way too much or dealing with way too much. You tell the story in some depth about Winston Churchill. I found it absolutely fascinating how he, few of us have to manage a war against the Nazis. We're dealing with our businesses. And sometimes it may feel like we're dealing with something that big, but clearly it's not. So he had this enormous undertaking, and he had to keep himself together mentally and physically. And you go into some detail. It's a model of how to go about doing that.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Winston Churchill was the most productive man of the 20th century. I mean, he wrote like 2 or 3 million words. He published like 30 books, gave thousands of speeches. He saved, he helped his country win 2 world wars. He did all these things, and when you would ask him what his sort of secret is, he would talk about his love of painting, and he laid bricks on his estate in the English countryside. He was a deep believer in the power of hobbies and the power of leisure and the power of rest and the balance that those things helped create in a busy, productive person. So I meet people, and it's like, what do you do? And they're like, I work. That's what they do. That's their whole life. They don't have families. They don't have hobbies. Not only do they not take vacations, but they don't take care of themselves, even like going to the gym or, joining a book club or whatever. And so I think Churchill, and when you really look at the literature, I mean, Aristotle said the main question of life is what do we fill our leisure time with? I think it's interesting. A lot of people today don't even have leisure time. So they're not only not answering the question correctly, they're not even in a position to ask the question. So a big part of stillness for me, it's not, look, you got to sit and meditate. It's you got to find something that lets you disconnect, gives you some peace, gives you relaxation, lets your mind go in a different direction this is going to be really important, not just in being successful, but in maintaining that success and avoiding burnout.
And, you're saying this not as somebody who is, running a New Age clinic,
No, I'm writing. I've got a family. I've got multiple companies and investments that I run. And I'm someone who struggles with my own life. I overcommit all the time. Yes, I'm not saying you've got, move to India and live in an ashram, or you've got to go on a 40-day meditation retreat. I'm saying, look, you need this to survive in the modern world.
So this book is I found it immensely practical because it will alert you to things that either you knew and forgot or really never knew.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a cookbook in a way. There's a lot of recipes. You have, for instance, the section on hobbies. What constitutes a hobby? What isn't a hobby? Because there are a lot of things that seem like hobbies that really aren't hobbies at all. And, why is a hobby necessary? Why did a guy who was running the British Empire's war against the Nazis take time out to paint? This seems almost crazy unless you think through the logic and then see the actual results that it had in his life. It allowed him to be more effective because, we generally start out in life as employees, and we don't necessarily aren't lucky to have, let's say, enlightened employers.
Sure.
And their main motivation, their main vision of us is to just, squeeze as much work as they can out of us.
Right.
And we're rewarded for doing that. We get the pats on the back. We get the attaboy. And there seems to be a logic, that if 10 hours of work is good, then 12 is better, and 14 is better than that, and 16 is even better. And in fact, no. There are times in life when you have to do that. Things come up, and you just have to do whatever it takes. But you can't do that forever. So you need another playbook. And that's what I love about Stillness is the Key. This is a playbook for, how you, humanize your life.
Yeah, I think it's like, look, what kind of life do you want? Your life can't be all accomplishments. It can't be all doing. There has to be stillness. There has to be balance. There has to be peace. Seneca said there is no greatness that is not also at peace, and I think he's absolutely right.
Hey, let's talk about the word stillness.
Yeah.
This is a pretty radical a word to put on a cover of a book, especially in our climate, in our civilization, which doesn't talk or think about stillness at all. Why this word? There's a lot of titles you could have given this book, but you singled out the word stillness.
Yeah, and look, stillness is the word is one of the few words that you see appear across all religions, all philosophical schools, from the Epicureans to the Stoics to the Buddhists to the Confucians to the Christians. You see it in Judaism. You see it in Islam. Equanimity, stillness, apatheia, ataraxia. There's all these different words for it, but at the core, what they're saying is, the ability to be sort of quietly alone with oneself, to be in a flow state, to slow things down, to think clearly, to not be jerked around by drives and emotions. That's the power of stillness, and that's what wisdom and work and all of this ultimately helps us create. And to me, I think when people hear the word stillness, they know exactly what it means. They know it's too rare in their life, but they know what it means, and they've certainly experienced it.
And it's something that we can cultivate and develop and get stronger in, daily. And it's a power.
Yeah, totally.
There's great power in stillness, which is, so it's not just, something that sounds nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have a quiet week away where the phone is off and you're not working? That's not what you mean by stillness. This is more of a way of being.
Correct.
So the book is Stillness is the Key. It's by Ryan Holiday. He's also the author of The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy. If you know and love those books, you're going to love this book. If you don't know Ryan's work yet, this is a great place to jump in. It is like a cookbook. You can read it from beginning to end. That's how I read it. But you could also just grab a chapter here and a chapter there. It's not a workbook in the sense of, formal workbook, but it is the kind of book that you can work through. In other words, take a chapter, just read one chapter a day or one chapter even a week and work on that concept. that's revealed in a particular chapter and figure out ways to integrate it into your life, and then go to the next one and the next one. That's how I plan to work on it myself. It's a book that points you in a direction. It's something that, obviously, something to read, something to consume, something to enjoy, but it's also something to use as a diving board into a stronger life, a more powerful life, through, ironically or paradoxically, through stillness, which is not the way we typically think about power and achievement. Great. Well,
awesome.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much.
That was great. Thank you for this book and for all the books you've written. Great.
I appreciate it. Well, thanks for doing your important work.
And that was our interview with Ryan Holiday, the author of a ton of books. And I don't like to be ageist, but I do have to point out, at the time of this interview, he's 32 years old. And his life is worth studying because he's gotten a lot done, including selling over 2 million books. And I'm going to give you the titles of them. They're all good. They're all worth reading. Some of them are more practical, business-oriented. Others are a little bit more philosophically oriented. But, if you get involved in philosophy, you're going to realize philosophy is the most practical thing of all. But anyway, here's the books that he's written over the years. Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator. That came out in 2012. And then in 2014, Growth Hacker Marketing, a primer on the future of PR, marketing, and advertising. Well worth reading. Then, in his philosophical stream of books, same year, 2014, The Obstacle is the Way, The Timeless Art of Turning Trials into Triumph. And that is a skill that you must master if you're going to be successful or even survive in this world. 2 years later, in 2016, he came out with Ego is the Enemy. That same year, The Daily Stoic, 366 meditations on wisdom, perseverance, and the art of living. Then in 2017, Perennial Seller, The Art of Making and Marketing Work That Lasts. And same year, The Daily Stoic Journal came out in, paperback form. And then a great book I really like. I like them all, but this is a real page-turner, Conspiracy. Peter Thiel, Hulk Hogan, Gawker, and the Anatomy of Intrigue. And it's an interesting book. It's a good read. It's a great story, and you can learn a lot. And then it looks like it came out with a different title in paperback, Conspiracy, A True Story of Power, Sex, and a Billionaire's Secret Plot to Destroy a Media Empire. It's a lot more sexy. But anyway, the new book, and the purpose of this interview, quite frankly, is to make you aware of the new book and get you to buy it now to help push it up in the sales rankings. That's the plan. Why am I doing that with this book? Because it's a very worthy book. This book is going to help you. This book is going to improve your life. This is a book you can work on and with for weeks, months, and years and get benefit from it endlessly. It's called Stillness is the Key, and the author, of course, is Ryan Holiday, and you can get it at all your favorite book outlets.